Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Nicholas Hamasevich, and I'm Director of Research and Academic Affairs here at the Korea Economic Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you to KEI for our academic paper series event today on Korean American voting behavior and its impact on future elections. We really appreciate you coming to this event, especially with all the other events and programs that are going around town in December. We're excited to have Dr. Taeku Lee, Professor of Political Science and Law, and the chair of the Travers Department of Political Science at the University of California Berkeley, here to talk about his thoughts and research on these issues. With the recent U.S. presidential election last month, one of the takeaways was the breakdown of the ethnic groups and how President Obama did so well in securing their vote. These numbers, along with some of the demographic numbers for some of these groups, will make understanding the voting behavior of these different ethnic groups in America even more important for those running for office in the future. Moreover, there is a growing understanding of the political importance of these groups after an election, especially in regards to the bilateral relationships and agreements between the United States and the ancestral countries of these groups. So we're pleased to have Dr. Taeku Lee, one of the top scholars, looking at race and ethnic issues and their impact on voting and elections with us here today. Taeku Lee is, again, Professor of Political Science and Law and Chair of the Travers Department of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Lee's recent book with Zoltan Hajnal, entitled Why Americans Don't Join the Party, was awarded the Best Book Award for the Race and Ethnic Politics section of the American Political Science Association. Dr. Lee has also written and co-edited several other books. Dr. Lee is currently co-principal investigator of the National Asian American Survey and is co-editing the Oxford Handbook of Racial and Ethnic Politics in the United States. He got his AB at the University of Michigan and MPP from Harvard University and his PhD from the University of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Taeku Lee.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and curious to know if I can figure out how this works. So I hit something to get this started.
Right.
Oh, there we go. So, you know, in most talks like this, there'll be a mix between getting new data or getting new thoughts and ideas and arguments. And I should just say up front that this data is a lot more about, this talk is a lot more about new data than it is about a lot of new arguments. There have been plenty of new arguments, and actually that's part of what I want to start out with related to the 2012 election. So I think probably in my lifetime in the US, I've never seen as much attention immediately after an election on Asian Americans as a group as there has been in the aftermath of this 2012 election. And a lot of that discussion has been around the question of what is going on with Asian Americans, and is this the harbinger, if you will, of a new kind of political realignment in the United States. So just as examples, if you're interested enough in this topic to be here, you've probably encountered some of these pieces. So Charles Murray in the AEI Ideas talks about some of the cultural values that he associates with Asian Americans and why this is a puzzle for him about why Asians aren't more Republican. There's a slightly different take by Richard Posner in Slate, Andrew Sullivan, and so on. This one I particularly like. The subheading title is How Not to Appeal to Asian Americans, and underneath there, next time, a little less racism. And that's one particular kind of argument about 2012. I've entered some of this fray myself with a piece in Monkey Cage and also an op-ed in the LA Times. It's hard not to have a view about what's happened in 2012, and a lot of it is related to, there's two kinds of pictures I can show here about why there's so much attention. One is the picture that if you've seen some exit poll results, you've probably seen a comparison across a whole bunch of different breakdown groups in terms of how they voted in 2008 and how they voted in 2012. With a lot of groups, there's some small shifts here and there in terms of how much more Democratic or Republican they got. And then there's one particular group Asian Americans, where there's a huge apparent change between 2008, where exit poll results had 62% voting of Asian Americans voting Democratic, to 2012 with 73%, according to exit polls, voting Democratic. The second kind of picture is to go even further back and look at 20 years of exit poll results to see how big of a change this really is, to the extent that we accept exit poll data. So if you look over a 20-year time period from the 1992 election with Clinton, Bush, and Perot, the partisan voting preferences of white Americans don't look that changed. For African Americans, there's a bit of a spike, which you might expect if you have the opportunity to vote for the first time for a presidential candidate of African American heritage, or at least mixed race, including African American heritage. But essentially, very, very high levels of support, and for the most part, a not terribly changed pattern. For Latinos, there's a little bit of a shift, and it's moving more in the Democratic direction over the last couple of election cycles. And then there's Asian Americans, where you see this sort of trend, if my clicker works. So in 1992, which is the first time there are exit poll data which really break down any kind of findings for Asian Americans as a group, what the exit polls found was that 54% of Asian American voters said that they had voted for George H.W. Bush, and only 31% for Bill Clinton, with the remainder going to Ross Perot. And from that low of 31%, we've now gone up to the latest election of 73%, saying that they had voted for Barack Obama. And there's no other demographic group over this time span, not just by race or ethnicity, but by any kind of major demographic category, that has moved quite as much over such a short time period. And so that's an interesting story to tell, and that's part of why a lot of these commentators that I started off with have jumped into the fray in terms of trying to tell their story, I would say ahead of some good data about what's really going on. So first I want to just share a few things about demographic background, which most of you probably know, but I think it's an important additional impetus behind why there's so much attention to Asian Americans in particular, and I want to situate Korean Americans within that. So, you know, this figure we've all seen in some form or another, which is the extent to which immigration patterns into the United States have changed dramatically post-Hart-Celler Act of 1965, and the degree to which Asian Americans are a big part of that shift, such that if you look at migration patterns today, the Asia region is the single largest contributor to in-migration into the United States today. And if you look at population change patterns between just two censuses, 2000 and 2010, there's no group that has grown as fast as Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. And then if you look at projected population growth over time, you know, the increased size of the Asian American Pacific Islander population is expected to continue to grow well into the mid-century, so that sometime between 2040 and 2050, we can expect that 1 out of every 10 residents in the United States will be a person of Asian origin. If you break that down by groups, I hate pointing things at people, but I'll just stop. If you break that down by groups, Asian Americans are, there's supposed to be white font here that says Korean 10%. So Asian Americans are 10% right now of, Korean Americans are 10% right now of Asian Americans as a group overall. So it's 10% of 5%. You might say that's really small, but if you consider change over time, that's a growing number of growing significance in terms of electoral politics. Then looking specifically at Korean American population dynamics, there's two kinds of slices at this story. One is to just look at what people call stocks in demographics, which is the total number of people in the United States of Korean American origin, and that's a number that's growing pretty markedly over time, much in the same way as that previous slide that I showed you in terms of changes in the Asian American population in total. If you look at flows, which is the percent change from one time period to another, there's a slightly different story, which is that there was a period in the 70s, 1980s, and 1990s, where the population of Korean Americans was growing very, very dramatically. That population growth has slowed quite a bit, but it's still at around 40%. And I think some of that change in population growth of Korean Americans has something to do with the economic development of Korea itself and the extent to which push-pull factors have changed in the calculus of migration between Korea and the United States. Then if you look at geography, one of the interesting patterns of immigration over the last 2 decades is the extent to which immigration into the United States is no longer just about these traditional historic gateways like New York City and Ellis Island and California and Angel Island, but it's really become a much more dispersed pattern across the country, so that it's still true that 1 out of every 3 Korean Americans is a Californian, but if you look at a map like this, you'll see that the patterns have really dispersed quite a bit, so that you can look to areas like Virginia and the DC metro area and see a very substantial Korean American population. And the other kind of cut at this is this is a lot of information. The main point of this slide is to just look here at the percent change between 2000 and 2010. Those are pretty dramatic increases over a 10-year time period. And those bubbles are the battleground states in 2012. And in those battleground states, for the most part, there are pretty dramatic increases as well in the size of the Korean American population. Now, what I want to mainly talk about is the data out of the 2012 version of the National Asian American Survey. This is the second time we've done this survey. It is, I think, the single most exhaustive kind of data on the politics of Asian Americans, and it's one that really emphasizes representativeness of Asian Americans, both within groups and as a group overall. So just to add a little color to that, this is our main website. You can get a lot of additional information over and above what I'm going to talk about here today. If you go to that website, it's a project. The 2012 version is a project that's led by 3 people. This is Karthik Ramakrishnan. Hopefully you recognize the person in the middle. And Karthik is a professor at UC Riverside, and the person on the right is Miriam Young, who is the executive director of National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. The 2008 version led to this book, Asian American Political Participation. The data from 2008 are publicly available if any of you are interested in it. And the 2008 version was Harold and Kumar again, and then Jane Jun, who's a professor at USC, and Janelle Wong, who's currently a professor at the University of Maryland. And part of what's really challenging on the front end and exciting on the back end about our NAS surveys is how difficult and how, in some ways, interesting it is for a survey researcher to try to collect data on a group that's as diverse as Asian Americans. So to do that, we have to do something like this kind of survey. So it's not your typical media horse race poll where you interview about 800 people and you see what they think and you slap on about a 4% margin of error onto that. So we interviewed over 6,000 people, which you might think is far too many. Part of the reason why we need to do that, I'll show you in a minute, is to be able to have a large enough number of respondents for each group to be able to say something like I will try to say today about a group like Korean Americans. We're in the field for a pretty long time, from midsummer to late October. We wanted to catch something of what was happening with conventions. We also wanted to go as far out towards the election day itself as possible to be able to look at changes, and I'll show you a little bit about that as well. So to interview Asian Americans as a group, you really have to take things like language, geographic specificity, and so on into account. To do the language piece right with this community, we interviewed in 11 languages. It's still the case today that if you see a survey, and this includes exit poll data on Asian Americans, you're typically looking at only English language interviews. And in about 40% of our interviews, we asked people what language they wanted to be interviewed in, and they opted for a non-English interview. And I've done other sorts of research that show that the kind of answers that people give, whether they're talking in English and if they're talking in a Asian language, look quite different. So you're tapping into different kinds of populations. For 2012, as opposed to 2008, we really tried to emphasize groups that had previously not been surveyed at all. So we have a first kind of reasonably nationally representative sample of Hmong Cambodians and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in this study. And we also really wanted to be able to say something about how Asian Americans compared to other groups, so we also have comparison samples of whites, blacks, and Latinos. What the actual breakdown looks like is something that looks pretty ugly, but if you eyeball it very quickly, part of our getting to 6,000 is to be able to have large enough numbers of different groups to be able to talk about each group on its own. Visually, that looks something like this in terms of our sample. And what I'm going to focus mainly on today is the subsample of 633 Korean Americans in the NAS data. Most of what I'm going to show you are results that are weighted, because if you just do these draws, it's not going to look exactly like the population as a whole. So on the back end, you have to do a little bit of weighting. And a lot of what I'm going to show you is mainly what voter-registered Korean Americans think about politics and how they voted in 2012. So that's an even smaller subsample than the 633. And that's also part of the reason why you have to interview about 600 people to be able to say something. So one of the stories that I want to share is that Korean Americans look pretty democratic, but it's not a really kind of a fixed result. There's a lot of politics that's still in play for this community. So democratic but undecided. I'll show you the high levels of support for President Obama, but also show you an extent to which there's a high degree of uncertainty about where Asian Americans and Korean Americans specifically stand on politics. I couldn't resist coming up with some interesting graphics. So this is Cho the plumber. Remember in 2008 there was all the hoo-ha about Joe the plumber. And I ran into this picture, which is a group of Virginia Korean Americans for Obama. So maybe one of you's actually in this picture. So what do our pre-election polls tell us about how Asian Americans were going to vote in 2012, and specifically how Korean Americans were going to vote in 2012? So if you just look at these bars, which is the percentage of people who, in our survey, who were vote registered and how they said they were going to vote, you might say your survey, Professor Lee, has nothing to do with what actually happened, because I just started off by showing you exit poll results where 73% of Asian Americans said they had voted for Obama. And these numbers look a lot lower. Part of that story has to do with this, which is if you add the percentage who said they would vote for Obama and the percentage who said they would vote for Romney, you're still pretty far away from 100%. So if you go all the way down to here and look at the two-way split between Obama and Romney, I'll show you a slide in a moment. It's pretty close to what exit poll results found. But this is the gap in between. Almost 40% of our sample of our weighted sample of registered voters in the Asian American community. This is in the summer before a pretty important election, and during a time period in which most horse race polls found maybe 5% of respondents saying, I don't really know how I'm going to vote. About 40% of Asian Americans said, I don't really know how I'm going to vote, even though I've registered to vote. And you can break this down further by people who said they voted in 2008, people who said they were absolutely sure they were going to vote. We've run likely voter models. The number doesn't change that much from this very high number of people who months or weeks before an election said they didn't really know how they were going to vote. If you just look at the two-way marginal, it's much closer to the kind of numbers that we saw in the exit polls. And for Korean Americans, 72% of the two-way split in our survey said that they were going to vote for President Obama and 28% for Romney. And if you look at this slide, the range across different Asian American groups is pretty wide, from Filipino Americans, who majority of whom said that they favored Romney over Obama, to Hmong and Asian Indians who almost look as high as African Americans in terms of their levels of support for President Obama. As I said, some of this story, we wanted to try to capture enough of a range in time over the election year to be able to see if there's any interesting changes over time. There's a slight pattern of greater support for President Obama from sort of midsummer, when we were surveying, all the way into early fall. And a slight decrease. We expected actually this line to go down quite a bit more in terms of the proportion who were uncertain about how they were going to vote. It turned out that it didn't really change that much. This is actually slightly different from what we found in 2008, where there was also a very high percentage who were undecided, but that proportion really declined quite a bit going into the last few weeks before the election. The last thing I'll show you on across time changes is that if you look carefully enough at the data, there are sort of two kinds of effects that you see. There's sort of a bounce that Romney gets around the Republican convention, and there's a similar bounce that Obama gets around the Democratic convention, and Obama sort of rides out that bounce. We don't see that much of an effect of President Obama's sort of infamous first presidential debate in our data on Asian American voter preferences. Now I'm going to share a few ways of breaking down how Asian Americans voted. There's one section that's on demographics. There's one section that's on key election issues, and then I'm going to show you what political scientists think of as the fundamentals of voting, which is what party you identify with. So if you break down our data into things like nativity, gender, and a range of other things, a few suggestive findings. One is if you compare immigrant and US-born Korean American citizens who registered to vote, there's a slight pattern of US-born Korean Americans being more supportive of President Obama. This is pretty consistent with what we found in 2008. This is a slight difference, but I'm not sure it's a big enough difference that it's even statistically significant. And I don't think it would really hold up if we start doing fancier statistics with our data. But we find that Korean American men were more supportive of President Obama than Korean American women. I've learned my life lesson well to not to speculate a whole lot on gender differences until I've really researched it thoroughly, so I'll just leave that at that. And then we find a pretty big effect in terms of interview language. So Korean Americans who chose to have a discussion about politics in Korean looked more partial to President Obama than Korean Americans who chose to have that same conversation in English. And some of the bigger demographic effects we find are actually by education and household income. So the education breakdown here is just into three pieces: less than college, having a college degree, and having some post-baccalaureate education. And you can see the highest levels of support for the Democratic candidate are among Korean Americans who have less than a college education. And there's a similar pattern by income group. It's even more pronounced. And this is actually true if you break down family income into more than just three categories. The greatest support that Mitt Romney seemed to be among middle-class Korean Americans, and the highest levels of support is among less well-off Korean Americans. One of the things that Karthik and I argue really mattered in a visible way that we didn't find in 2008, partly because we didn't ask as many questions about actual issues that Asian Americans and Korean Americans care about, were issues in the election. So if it's not these sort of demographic building blocks, what is it? So we asked people what they thought were the most important issues going into the 2012 election in terms of how they were going to vote. This is probably not going to surprise anybody that still on the road for recovery from the Great Recession, Asian Americans, Korean Americans are no different from any other group in thinking that jobs, something having to do with the economy was going to be very important to how they were going to vote. So the question was specifically asked in terms of how they were going to vote. I should also say, I'll show you a number of slides that compare Korean Americans in our survey to all the other Asian Pacific Islander groups in our survey. There's not a huge difference here in terms of the salience of jobs, but there are a lot of other issues that were also important to Korean Americans and Asian Americans. So there was a high percentage of our respondents who said, I actually am really worried about the budget deficit as well, worried about healthcare, education, and then the numbers start to go down when you look at other issues like foreign policy, immigration, women's rights, and gay rights or LGBT issues. One thing that you will notice if you compare Korean Americans to all other Asian groups is, as a whole, Korean Americans didn't seem to point to as many issues as being really critical in how they were going to vote. So across the board, the percentages for other Asian groups were a little bit higher. So one might infer from this kind of result that there weren't as many across the board issues that really Korean American voters were focused on. Now, what you really want to know with this kind of data is, did people who say that these were really important issues see a big difference between the two candidates? And so that's what the next slide sort of asks. If you said, let's say, women's rights or women's issues were really important to how you were going to vote in 2012, which candidate did you see as being closer to your views on that issue? So this is how you can win political issues that are really important to you. On jobs, it's pretty clear that more Korean Americans thought that Obama was closer to where they stood on the best way to recovery in terms of jobs. This is well, I'll show you for Korean Americans, there's an odd result coming towards the end. But this is really, in terms of the big meat and potato issues of 2012, this is the one area with Asian Americans in general and Korean Americans more specifically where Romney really could have made greater inroads than he actually did, is on the budget deficit. So it's a pretty even split between Obama and Romney on the budget deficit. But on almost every other issue, Korean Americans preferred what they heard from President Obama by a pretty wide margin to what they were hearing from Mitt Romney. So with immigration and women's issues, foreign policy, education, healthcare, big margins in favor of President Obama. This last slide again, which I'll share with you, and I'm curious to know what you think. This is not like what we find for all other Asian American groups in our sample, but for people who said gay rights or LGBT issues were really important to them in the election, a lot of Korean Americans seem to like what Mitt Romney had to say, which suggests that this is more of a form of moral conservatism and the extent to which gay rights issues were very salient for Korean Americans in the 2012 election. For the rest of our Asian American sample, the figures actually go the other way, so that if people said that LGBT issues were really important, then they tended to favor where President Obama was. So this is maybe a split in values between Korean Americans and a lot of other Asian American groups. Sorry. So for political scientists, if you had to know one thing about somebody going into an election, what you'd want to know is what party they identify with. For at least 50 years of political science research, party identification is really supposed to be the foundation stone from which everything else that matters politically, at least at the individual level, can be known. What's interesting about Asian Americans, and this goes to the book, Why Americans Don't Join the Party, that Dr. Hamasevich talked about earlier, is there's a lot of Asian Americans for whom this sort of foundational question, what party do you identify with, really doesn't make that much sense or hold that much meaning. So if you go all the way to this end, which is the total for the whole sample, if you just look at the two-way split between people who say, yeah, I identify as a Democrat, and you identify as a Republican, Asian Americans will look a lot more Democratic than Republicans. So 35% out of the 50% who choose a side, that's almost exactly the same as what we saw in the 2012 election, right? So 70% split. And so there seems to be a close correspondence between party identification and actual voting behavior. But what's almost as important is 50% don't pick sides. Even though these are registered voters who are going to go out and, for the most part, vote more Democratic. So 30% of that remaining 50% self-identify as independents, and 20% actually don't answer the question or say, I don't know how to answer this question, or these categories are not that meaningful to me. And that's quite a big chunk of the Asian American community. In terms of dealing with survey data, how I was trained to deal with this group in graduate school was to just throw it out of the analysis. If people can't answer a question, then this must be an invalid response. And that's 20% of the whole sample. In Korean Americans' case, that's 9% of the sample. But so this is one of the real puzzles in thinking about the politics of Asian Americans as a group and Korean Americans specifically, is the degree to which, even though you can find consistent patterns in voting behavior, such as favoring the Democratic candidate for president and that trend over time, it's still the case that in terms of parties, there's a much more ambiguous story there. Now, it turns out that if you do identify with a party, it makes a big difference in terms of how you're going to vote. So for people, this is the Korean American sample. So for Korean Americans who said they identified as Democrats, 3 out of 4 said they were going to vote for Obama. Almost none of them said they would vote for Romney. And there was still a level of indecision, but 24% is much lower than 40%. Korean Americans who identified as Republicans were a little bit, I think there's less of a partisan story. So 50% of that, 57% of that group said they were going to vote for Romney, but there's still a pretty high level of undecided voters, even among self-identified Korean American Republicans. And then, as you might expect, among self-identified independents, and this fourth group of non-identifiers, that's the 20% who choose not to answer the question because it's not meaningful to them. The levels of undecided voters are quite high. So the party identification story, the partisanship story, is still a story that remains to be told. So 2 other kinds of cuts at the election itself, and then I'm going to move to a few non-electoral things, and then have a discussion about what sense to make of it all. So one other way you can kind of look at where an election is going is just to ask people what their likes and dislikes are. So in a lot of cases, we spend far too much time focusing on how people think and less focusing on how people feel. And so these sorts of questions are just trying to get at emotions and affects. So when you think of President Obama, is that favorable or is it unfavorable? And you can see that Obama's favorability ratings among Korean Americans is quite high. Even Romney's favorability ratings among Korean Americans is reasonably high, especially by comparison to other Asian Americans. But one of the big contrasts that I would focus your attention to is between favorability ratings for Obama and favorability ratings for the Democrats and for Romney and the Republicans. What strikes me is that there's a pretty big gap here in terms of favorability ratings for Obama as opposed to the Democratic Party. And there's much less of that gap between Romney and the Republican Party. So that says that there's some story about Obama the person, Obama the candidate, and the politician that enjoys a lot of positive affect among Korean Americans, above and beyond what they think about the party as a whole. And then the last piece is one of the best sources of evidence about how a group is going to behave in one time period is to look at how they behaved in the last time period. If you looked at that story, for Obama it makes a good deal of sense. So close to 70% of Korean Americans who said they had voted for President Obama in 2008 said that they were going to vote for him again in 2012. Although even there, you'll notice that 28% of Korean Americans who said they had voted for Obama in 2008 weren't sure who they were going to vote for in 2012. The story for Korean Americans who said they had voted for the Republican candidate John McCain in 2008 is much more mixed, and maybe this is part of the story of the change. So that even among Korean Americans who had voted Republican in 2008, there was 40% who were undecided about whether they would vote Republican again in 2012, and 9% who said, actually this time I'm going to go for the Democratic candidate. And Governor Romney only enjoyed about half of, at least when we were in the field, support that John McCain had enjoyed in 2008. So I wanted, I think I still have some time to share some of, we have a lot, this is, our 2012 NAS is about a 30-minute interview, and in 30 minutes you can actually cover a lot of ground over the telephone in terms of talking about politics. So I want to share a lot of where we're going with our research is to really get a better sense of what are the issues that are really moving some of these shifts over time. So I'm going to show you a few things that basically argue that Korean Americans as a segment of the electorate have pretty liberal values on a wide range of policy issues. This question is mainly just an agenda setting question. So what do you think is the most important problem facing the country going into the election this year? And here, there are no huge surprises. So the economy in general, almost, well, at least 2 out of 3 respondents identify that as the single most important issue. For Korean Americans, there's a good deal of interest in unemployment and jobs, healthcare. Here's one big difference between Korean Americans as a group and all other Asian groups. So a pretty surprising number to us anyway of Korean Americans identified racism and race relations as a really big issue going into the election, and so on. This is more about just table setting. What's really on people's minds going into the election? And then we asked a range of very specific questions about specific policy areas. So how much has the Great Recession affected the Korean American community? One way of asking it, looking at that, is to just ask people, are you better off, worse off, or about the same financially as you were a year ago? For that question, 8% of Koreans said that they were worse off than they were a year ago, not too different from our sample as a whole. We also asked if you've personally experienced a home foreclosure. 4% of Korean Americans said that they had, and then we also asked if you have been laid off or lost your job as a result. Actually, it was not, we didn't cue them to the recession, we just said, have you been laid off or lost your job in the last year, and 14% said that they had. So those are to us, those are pretty alarming numbers that for a group that at least certain observers like Charles Murray think are unambiguously enjoying the fruits of America's economy, that there are reasonably high rates of negative economic outcomes such as that. Then we asked about a range of different financial dimensions of our life, and we asked people, is this a really serious issue for you? And here we actually find that Korean Americans don't seem to be facing a level of economic risk, at least not one that they're willing to share with a stranger over a telephone interview as much as other Asian groups are. So we asked, are you having problems paying your credit card bills, paying the rent, paying your medical bills, student loans, with elderly care and college tuition? About, a range of 9 to 26% of Korean Americans said that these are very serious problems for them. And that's a pretty high proportion of the Korean American community, but it's also much lower than what we find for all other Asian groups, where the range who say these are really serious problems for them are between 21% and 45% in the case of paying for college tuition. Bless you. Turning to healthcare, we asked what do you think about the Affordable Care Act? And do you think it's going to be better for your family and better for the country as a whole? These two bars that we just wanted to know whether people's opinions would vary whether we defined it as the Affordable Care Act or whether we defined it as Obamacare. So does the labeling of this as Obamacare really draw down support for healthcare reform? And we find that it really doesn't really matter whether you call it Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. For the most part, Korean Americans and Asian Americans as a group seem quite supportive of it. And a much higher percentage think that this is just generally a good thing for the country, even above and beyond the proportions who think that I'm personally going to benefit from this or my family's personally going to benefit from the Affordable Care Act. On immigration policy, we asked whether people would favor allowing undocumented or illegal immigrants to get a driver's license, whether they should have the ability to pay in-state tuition, and whether they should have a pathway to citizenship. And what we find is for Korean Americans, for the most part, if you combine strongly agree with somewhat agrees, that's a pretty sizable majority, more than 2/3 with 2 out of the 3 questions and around 2/3 with a third one, who really feel like even if you're undocumented, you should have access to these basic elements of life in American society. On deficit reduction, we asked 2 questions. One, do you favor essentially finding a road out of our deficit predicament by taxing the rich? Never mind, we didn't ask them whether that was actually going to get us out of our budget deficit to just tax people with incomes above $250,000, but we asked them if they supported that as an idea. Korean Americans seem to support that pretty strongly. So almost 80% supported that at some level, and more than half supported it quite strongly. And that's a much higher percentage than for other Asian American groups. And then the other question we asked is, how about a cuts-only approach? Do you favor that as a way of getting out of the deficit? And levels of support for that were much lower. So if you think back on those sets of questions about the economy, about healthcare, about immigration, about the budget deficit, that's a pretty liberal set of values that we're finding among Korean Americans in our survey. And I think that goes a much further way towards telling the story about why the Korean American vote was so democratic than a lot of the other stories that are out there in the media right now. I also couldn't resist the opportunity to ask a few questions about Korea-specific issues. So one question that we asked is whether Korean American respondents felt that the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement is going to be something that will benefit both economies. And here I played around with the data a number of different ways. The biggest splits that I find, which still require an explanation, are between registered voters and Korean Americans who are not registered voters. It's a much more pronounced effect than looking at foreign-born versus US-born or cutting at the data in some other ways. But for Korean Americans who are vote registered, the degree to which they thought Chorus FTA was a really good thing was quite robust. They seemed quite enthusiastic about it as a win-win for both economies. There's a little more skepticism among Korean Americans who are not vote registered in terms of Chorus FTA. Then we asked one question about North Korea, which we deliberately wanted to make a difficult question. So we said, do you favor US humanitarian aid to North Korea, even if it means keeping Kim Jong-un in power? And there was much more of a split in opinion, but again, we see a little bit of a different level of traction between with registered voters than we do with non-registered voters, with registered voters actually seeming to be more opposed to the idea of humanitarian aid to North Korea if it means keeping Kim Jong-un in power. So I'm going to end with just a few things that are looking forward in terms of some of our survey data. One of the things that a lot of political scientists do too much of is just focus on what happens every 4 years on a Tuesday in November. And it's really important if you're trying to see if a population is growing into a very defined, crystallized kind of political community, what's going on in other walks of political life. So beyond voting, we look at things like the extent to which people engage in campaigns, political contributions, contacting their elected or appointed representatives, just doing community work, working with others in your community to solve common problems, getting online to talk about politics, and then engaging in protest behavior. And I guess, you know, in some of these measures, Korean Americans don't seem as engaged as other Asian American groups. And Asian Americans as a whole, by some of these measures, are not quite as engaged as whites and African Americans. So there's a story to be told there about getting more involved in other parts of politics beyond voting, and I hope to get into that more in my future research out of the 2012 survey. We also wanted to look at the extent to which Korean Americans get involved in the politics of their home country, and we asked about it in 4 different ways. One is the extent to which you just maintain regular contact with friends and family in Korea. The rates are quite high for Korean Americans. So this includes a US-born, you know, second generation sample of Korean Americans as well. 85% of our total sample said that they do maintain in some kind of contact with Koreans in Korea. We asked about the extent to which they follow politics of what's going on in Korea. So let's say next week's election, more than 50% say that they do follow the politics of Korea. And then we asked about whether or not they follow US foreign policy to try to get more specific. And the numbers don't change that much. And finally, we asked if they send money back to their home country. To me, this is a little bit assuring or more reassuring as compared to our 2008 survey. So Korean Americans look like they send money back to Korea at lower levels than other Asian Americans, but this margin is much smaller than it was in 2008, where in our 2008 data, it just seemed like Korean Americans were very cheap in terms of their pattern of remittances. And finally, in terms of going back to a presumption, really, in the first slide that I showed, of a lot of media attention on what's happening with with Asian Americans as a group, and whether or not this means that there's a fundamental kind of realignment happening in American politics writ large. One real assumption there is that there is such a thing as an Asian American community as a group that's politically meaningful. And it's a presumption that I think is worth looking at, because it's such a diverse set of interests, set of religions, set of languages, set of cultures, and so on. So one of the things we asked about that, to see if there's a basis on which there could be an Asian American political community to speak of as a group, is to ask people what they thought was the basis of commonality for all Asians in the US. So we asked specifically, you know, do you think Asian Americans share something that you would think of as a common race, common culture, common economic interests, or common political interests? And these results actually mirror pretty closely what we found in 2008. And I'll say 2 more things about it. One of the other things that we found in 2008 was that Korean Americans seem more inclined to see a basis of commonality for Asians as a group than did other Asian Americans. And we find that sort of pattern as well. With the exception of common economic interests, you'll see that Korean Americans are more inclined to say that there's some basis of commonality for Asians as a people. One interesting difference that we find between our 2008 study and our 2012 study is the very last column on the right, the extent to which people thought that Asian Americans, that politics was a basis of commonality for Asian Americans. In 2008, that figure was 37%, and it wasn't that different for Korean Americans. So if this is a real shift, then it's a pretty clear sign of the development of a political community, that over a 4-year time period, there can be a pretty large change in the proportion of Asian Americans who really take politics as a basis for collective action and the pursuit of common interests. I think I've taken a lot of time already, so I will just end there. And these are thanks to the different funders and partners of this study, and thanks to you. And I'll come back down here for any questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Lee. That was fascinating stuff. We have a couple microphones, so we can take some questions from the audience if we have any. Raise your hand, and we'll bring them around. Right over here.
Shai Shipper from the Foreign Service Institute. In your demographic data, I do not see age in there. I'm just wondering, you account for age or not? I know that Karthik did when he did a study in 2008. Mm-hmm. So the reason I asked is because I remember looking at data in Los Angeles, particularly among the Vietnamese American voters. And historically, the Vietnamese American tend to vote Republicans. Mm-hmm. And you see a shifting data that the differences between those who are voting for Republicans and those who are voting for Democrats can be explained by the difference of the generation gap as the population becomes younger and younger. I'm also wondering if this is a case with the Asian American voters. Is that because the total voting population of the Asian American are becoming younger, and that's why you see a higher increase of Democratic or not? If you can talk about a little bit about age in your Democratic data.
Sure, that's a great question. I'll talk about age and generation effects, but also about Vietnamese Americans specifically, because that's one of the really interesting changes that we find between 2008 and 2012. There's actually two important groups that seem to move between those two time periods. One is that Filipinos appear more Republican than we thought in 2008. And some of that is a California versus outside California story. So in California, Filipinos as a group are still majority Democrat, even though it's not a very big majority. But outside of California, Filipinos as a group are pretty Republican. The other, even more pronounced shift, though, is in what we find about Vietnamese Americans. So right until 2008, and even in 2008, we were surprised at the high levels of democratic voting among Vietnamese Americans. But right until 2008, it was sort of a conventional wisdom that if you wanted to find an Asian group that was very heavily Republican, just look at Vietnamese Americans. In 2012, a pretty healthy majority of Vietnamese Americans in our study said that they were going to vote for Barack Obama. And by all accounts from exit polls, they did vote for Barack Obama. And some of that, I think, is a generational effect, and some of it, I think, is a result of shifting patterns of migration. So if you look at the Vietnamese American community in Orange County, even within California, it's still majority Republican. But I think Vietnamese Americans as a community have grown far and beyond just California, so they're in all different parts of the country. And for those Vietnamese Americans, I think their voting patterns now look a lot more democratic. In terms of generational differences, actually the kind of received wisdom that you'll find the highest levels of democratic voting among the youngest age cohorts for Americans as a whole doesn't quite apply to Asian Americans. So you'll find pretty high levels of democratic voting among your youngest age group, so let's say 18 to 29, but it's not as high as you'll find up for democratic voting among Asian Americans more in their middle age category, more in sort of my age group. Now, what you do find is increased rates from year to year in terms of the percentage of Asian American voters who are young adults. And one thing that we find that we don't quite know what to make of is in terms of the percentage who said they're not sure how they're going to vote, that percentage is really low for 18 to 29-year-olds. So if you're a young adult who's Asian American and know you're going to vote, you actually know who you're going to vote for in a way that's different from other age groups. That's actually quite different than what the general pattern that you find in the electorate, where young adults are, of course, less likely to vote as compared to older adults, but they're also less certain how they're going to vote. So we find a very different story for young adult Asian Americans. Just one last point on generation. I think if generation told a big part of the story, there was, I probably went over it too quickly, but I looked at some demographic differences. I think you would have seen a much bigger difference between foreign-born Korean Americans and U.S.-born Korean Americans. There was a slight difference that we did see, which was that U.S.-born Korean Americans were more likely to vote for Obama, but it wasn't a really pronounced difference. So I think that's telling a little bit of the story, but not a whole lot of it.
All right, Linda.
Hi, Linda Kim with the Korea Economic Institute. Actually, I have a couple of questions. One was regarding voter turnout. I saw that the different percentages, how they voted based on their party and also undecided, but what's actually the voter turnout rate for Asian Americans? I know that for 2004, it was pretty low. So what type of hurdles is causing them not to vote, and what are some issues that would actually drive them to vote? And then my second question has to do with the Nevada. What is it that spurred that large growth rate from 2000 to 2010 to be 93%? I know for Asian Americans as a whole, it's over 100%. So what was it that caused Korean Americans to move to Nevada?
I'm not going to say anything about gambling. That's an interesting question. I think some of it is probably a spillover effect of California as a magnet for immigrants from Asia, and also migration within the United States from California into Nevada. So I think that's some of the effect that you find. I actually don't know of a study that looks specifically at that effect, but it's a really interesting question. On voter turnout, I mean, I think, so what are the biggest challenges? There's one clear answer to what the biggest challenge in terms of voter turnout for Asian Americans as a group is, which is getting registered to vote. If you look at naturalization rates compared to other foreign-born populations, Asian Americans don't look that different. Korean Americans don't look that different. So the rates of naturalization once you're eligible are pretty high. If you look at voter turnout among vote registered, for Asian Americans and Korean Americans, there's not that much difference. It's about 80, I think for Asian Americans as a group, that figure is about 86% of those who are vote registered actually say that they turn out to vote. And for the US as a whole, that number is close to 90%. That's not a huge difference. The hugest difference is in terms of being a citizen and registering to vote. So for Asian Americans, I think it's a little over 60% and a little under 2/3. That's quite low as compared to the country as a whole, where it's about 80–85%. So the biggest gap there for Asian Americans is in getting registered to vote. And that's actually also, I think, where we've seen some of the biggest inroads in the last two election campaigns. I think the Change for America campaign really was what a lot of media accounts said it was, in terms of being a grassroots effort to get out a lot of groups that were historically considered low propensity voters and getting them registered to vote and getting them to turn out to vote. So if you look at current population survey data between 2004 and 2008, they estimate 5 million new voters. Of that 5 million, a little more than 2 million of them were African American, a little more than 2 million of them were Latino, and more than 600,000 were Asian American. And that's where the big change in voter turnout between 2004 and 2008 are. I think when the 2012 current population survey data come out later next year, I think you'll find that Asian American turnout also went up again in 2012. Our estimates are that it'll probably be more modest at around 3%. If you look at some of the exit polls, they suggest that it might be even higher, but I don't know how much if you look at exit poll data and start breaking it down by the number of respondents in exit polls who are Asian American, you start getting into some pretty small numbers. So I don't know how much I trust that, but I think the general direction will be that you'll have found higher voter turnout among Asian Americans in 2012, even than 2008, which was a pretty record high.
Yeah, we'll go with the lady in the green.
Thanks, Professor.
Hello.
Hi, former student. The 73% number that I've seen, which has kind of been accepted conventional wisdom, do you know where they got that number? Because I was doing a little research about it. It seemed like it was taken from an ALDEF exit poll, and I was a little skeptical about the accuracy of it. So I'm just curious about that. Second thing is, I want to know is, because you pointed out the one thing that was an anomaly in terms of social issues on LGBT issues, was whether you guys tested some of those questions in your, because I'm not frankly surprised at all, probably most people aren't. My entire family voted for Prop 8 in California, very socially conservative, they go to church. And I remember after 2004, when John Kerry lost, and I was raging about this to my mother, she's like, well, John Kerry didn't stand up for marriage. So, so it's just kind of like not not surprising me, and I'm sure there's generational issues with that too. So if you could just address those. Thanks.
Yes. So the 73% number actually does come from the Edison National Election Pool sample of Asian American voters. But the way in which exit polls go about conducting their survey methods would at least make me question that figure a little bit. So I think they're all conducted only in English, so that if you're limited English proficiency, you either have questionable data quality or people aren't going to respond to those interviews. There's also issues about how the NEP goes about figuring out which precincts to do their exit polls in ways that are likely to be less representative of groups like Latinos and Asian Americans. But having said all that, it's interesting that the number corresponds pretty closely to what advocacy group exit poll numbers look like and what our survey numbers would have predicted. So that actually gives me a little bit of reassurance that at least the trend over 20 years of Asian Americans and Korean Americans as a group looking more democratic is probably a real one. It's not like charges during this election year. It's probably not a made-up fact, but it's probably something that's actually happening on the ground. In terms of LGBTQ issues, I think the shortest answer I can give is stay tuned. So one of our biggest funders for our 2012 survey was Ford Foundation, who really wanted to know what Asian Americans as a group thought about reproductive health issues and LGBTQ issues. So about 10 minutes of our survey were actually pretty in-depth questions about that. And if you can play out your stereotypes about Asian Americans, or even just think about your friends and relatives, that's probably a pretty uncomfortable conversation that a lot of people in our survey had. And we haven't had a chance yet to look at a lot of that data, but we have a lot of it.
Sarah?
Hello, thank you for your very informative presentation. So I saw in one of your slides that Korean Americans vote less on electoral issues compared to the other AAPI population. So why do you think that is? And if you were a politician running, how would you, given that situation, how would you appeal to the Korean American population? And then second question is, after the re-election of President Obama, there was a lot of coverage on minority voting, minority support for President Obama after the election. Korean American population or Asian Americans were not really covered a lot. There were a lot of mention of Hispanic voters, Latino voters, and African American voters. So do you have any comment on that? Why do you think that is, and how can we change that?
I missed the second part of your question about minority voters.
There was a lack of media coverage about Asian American voters compared to the other minority voters. So why do you think that is, and how can we change that?
So I actually think I would agree with you in terms of pre-election media coverage, but I think in terms of post-election media coverage, it's hard to know what the right amount of media coverage for a particular group is. But I think there's one result which really jumped out of the exit polls, which was that Asian Americans were the group that seemed to be moving the most. And so, I think one kind of very dominant story out of last month's election is that, it seemed like even though going into Election Tuesday, a whole bunch of pundits and I'm sure political campaigns paid a lot of attention to what Latinos were likely to do, and they sort of knew that there was something happening in terms of demographic change and the degree to which Obama and the Democratic Party might benefit from that democratic change. I think the actual results on Election Tuesday caught some people by surprise, the extent to which it seemed like there was an emerging a new alignment of the Democratic Party built around Latinos and Asian Americans looking much more democratic than a lot of people might have thought. I mean, even outside of exit polls, if you go back to some of the earliest polling on what Asian Americans thought about politics, they look either pretty split in terms of being Republican or Democratic, or actually looking more Republican. So that, the earliest political science studies on what Asian Americans thought about politics thought that this would be a mainly foreign policy driven, sort of very particular kind of vote in the electorate that was likely to be more Republican. So if you looked at Vietnamese Americans, Korean Americans, Filipinos in terms of their U.S. foreign policy experience. The thought was that this was going to be a group that was going to be pretty Republican. So that's been a pretty big change. And so I think actually there was a fair bit of media attention, at least historically, compared to how much attention is given to Asian Americans after this particular election. I think, I mean, I haven't actually gone back and done any of the media content analysis, but I would bet that after 2004, 2008, and 2000, there was almost nothing about what happened with the Asian American vote. And this time around, there was quite a bit of attention given to it. I think, so I think in terms of your first question about whether issues matter less for Korean Americans, I wouldn't be willing to quite say that yet, because I mean a lot of the devil is in the details once you actually run more kind of multivariate statistics on the figures that I've shown about the extent to which particular issues might or might not have mattered. But overall, I think that's what I shared, is that I think the extent to which people identified issues as really important going into elections was lower for Korean Americans. And sometimes you find this balance between the group basis out of which people tend to vote and specific issue-specific basis that drive people's vote. And I think there's a general sense that we got in 2008, which I think is also confirmed in 2012, that Korean Americans seem a lot more, not a lot, they seem a little more group-based in how they vote. So less focused on things like specific issues and maybe more focused on their racial identity or the extent to which commonality with other Asians or with other groups might matter. And I think the other addition that I would be curious about, but I haven't had a chance to look at, is the relationship between religion and politics. So Korean Americans do stand out compared to other Asian American groups in terms of their high degree of religiosity. And one change that I think might be happening over the last few election cycles for Korean Americans is that historically I think Korean churches have not been a place where you see a lot of politics talked about or a lot of politics happening. It wouldn't surprise me if that's changed in the last couple of election cycles.
We'll go here, right up here.
In a very simplified manner, they said self-deportation was one of the reasons that Romney lost the Latino vote. I noticed with the presentation you had up there, for Asian Americans and Korean Americans, they tended to lean towards stances that Obama had, but it wasn't a priority issue. How does that compare to the general population or Latino and African Americans you also looked at?
Yeah, so I think, well, for one thing, outside of comments about self-deportation in the Republican primaries, I think 2012 was notable for the extent to which immigration really wasn't that salient in the general election. Both candidates seemed to be running away from it like it was, the H1N1 virus or something like that. They really didn't want to be pinned down to very specific issue positions on immigration. And not surprisingly, when candidates do that, we don't find a great deal of, Asian Americans thinking that this is, a huge hot button issue in 2012. So, when asked if immigration is a key issue, not that many said that it was a key issue. But for people who did say it was a key issue, they saw a huge difference between the two groups. And some of it is that a lot of the immigration debate in the United States today has really been dominated by this issue of what to do about undocumented or illegal immigrants. And I think on the ground, one kind of popular myth about undocumented immigration is that it's all from Mexico. And in fact, actually, a reasonably, it's an issue on which it's hard to get very reliable numbers. But to the extent that there are some numbers on it, I think you would say somewhere between 10 to 30% of it comes from Asia. And some of the big contributing groups in terms of undocumented immigrants in these studies are, Filipinos, I think Vietnamese and Koreans are the three largest groups of Asian undocumented immigrants. And so, maybe this is an issue on which the extent to which a lot of the rhetoric has turned to specifically negative public discourse about undocumented immigrants. Maybe it doesn't play that well to the Republican Party side and plays better to the Democratic Party side.
Were the priorities similar with the African American groups?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to punt on that because we do ask the same set of questions of white, Latino, and African American respondents. We actually have not had a chance to look at that at all, but I'd be really curious to see. Yeah.
Yep, right up here in the front.
Hi, I'm Komei Isozaki, CSIS visiting fellow. Sorry to came in late. I have two questions. One is, why are Filipinos more Republican than other Asian Americans? The second one is, what motivates Koreans to immigrate to the United States? Because I don't think the economy doesn't explain everything. Koreans is not a poor country anymore. On the contrary, Japan is economy is not good, but it's very reluctant to go abroad, study abroad, and immigrations. What are the differences, and how many of the Koreans, Americans from North Korea? Thank you.
The third question is really interesting. It would have been great for us to have asked that, but we haven't asked that. I think you could probably get some sense of that from census data because they ask about country of ancestry. So to the extent that they, for a lot of Korean Americans, it's not a either or between North and South Korea, but if you have some family in North Korea, it's probably both and. So it's the kind of, when you collect data, you ask people to pick one thing. But I think for a lot of Koreans that have origins in North Korea, I think they also have a family history in South Korea as well, at least, over a 50-year time period. In terms of why immigrate, why do Korean Americans immigrate to the United States? I think you're right that because the Korean economy is so healthy now, there's less of a push factor in terms of immigrating to the United States. And the data show that immigration rates to the U.S. from Korea have really slowed quite a lot. But there's still some pull factors like, there are now a lot of Korean American families. And so family ties and social networks are always, a pull factor drawing people into a country. So those are still there. But I think, if you project out to 10 or 20 years, I think the rates of migration for Korean Americans might look quite similar to what it's looked like for quite a few decades for Japanese Americans. So I think as Asian economies really develop and become healthy and self-sustaining on their own, I think you'll see a lot less of this sort of push factor for migration. Filipino Americans, I really, what's the best answer I can give? When I share this result with my close Filipino American friends, they say, you're right, and then they don't tell me, they don't share any speculation about why that's the case. So obviously I think it's an interesting question for which I think that I'd love to dig more deeply into. I think a lot of people have looked at why Vietnamese Americans might be, or at least had been heavily Republican in the past, but I haven't seen as much that I know of in terms of carefully thought through, if not researched, opinions about why Filipino Americans seem to be more Republican than Democratic. Now, it's close to a 50-50 split, so it's not as though this group is very heavily Republican. So it's just they're not as democratic as the rest of Asian Americans.
And a question over here.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Hi. Thank you, Professor Lee, for your presentation. I was very interested in your research because I'm one of the co-founders of Korean Americans for Obama in 2012. And so I spent basically a year of my life trying to organize the Korean American community across the country. And so your research, as you were doing your slides, I'm like, oh yeah, I saw that. I just kind of like the, when we did our phone banking and reaching out to the Korean American community, there was overwhelming support for Obama. And it's definitely shown there in your graphs and charts. The LGBT issue, that was definitely something we encountered as well. And when President Obama came out in support of gay marriage, that was something we had to think about. So I'm just wondering if there's, a lot of times in your presentation you said, oh, there's a story to be explored here, and I'm just wondering, we organized this past year, we have a group of Korean Americans across the country, and now we're thinking about next steps of how to mobilize after the election. So I'm wondering whether it's geographically or generationally, first generation, 1.5, second generation, if there's some thread there or story that you've noticed throughout your research that would be something to think about for someone who's trying to organize next steps. For example, geographically, I just noticed it correlates a lot with the population, of course, in Korean Americans. So when we thought about organizing, I think this was the first time that Korean Americans organized nationally for a presidential election. And so even starting the chapters, of course, we had one in LA, San Francisco, New York, New Jersey. But then we had an unexpected, say, Miami. We had a chapter there. But so things like that, if you had any insights, I was curious.
I think you probably have much better insights than I do from your work on the campaign. I think what you're seeing in terms of Korean Americans as a community is a shift from essentially the pioneering homesteading phase of an immigrant group's adaptation to a new society to sort of a stakeholding phase of a new immigrant's adaptation to a new society. So I think my generation of Korean Americans was a generation in which you heard about the first Korean American to do this or to do that or to do that, and I think now it's more about building community from the grassroots up, and I think that's a lot of I think the Obama campaign in 2008 was a real opportunity to start that process and get it going with a lot of momentum, and I think you saw even more momentum in 2012. A lot of that kind of grassroots organizing and institution building, I think, happens outside of elections. It happens in between these 4-year time periods, and I think there's a lot of leadership training that happens. I think Abraham Kim is involved with some of it in terms of the Korean American community. Because one of the big gaps now for Korean Americans is, and it's a general gap for all Asian Americans, is in terms of the number of Korean Americans and Asian Americans who actually successfully achieve elected office. There's no group that has a bigger gap in terms of the percent of the population that it comprises and the percent of elected representatives than Asian Americans. Asian Americans now are 6% of the U.S. population. They're 1% of all elected offices, whether it's federal or state and local. That's a pretty big gap. So, I think Obama has done a lot as a president in terms of making very high-profile appointments of Asian Americans. I think it's historic, the number of high-profile appointments, and also specifically of Korean Americans. But that's a different story than, being able to seed young Korean Americans, have them think about politics as a career, representing Korean American interests as a career, getting them to run, getting the party to agree that this would be a reasonable candidate, that being a person of Korean or Asian American descent would be reasonable as a political candidate, and then having them successfully win office, and then advocate for Korean American, Asian American issues as an elected official. I think that's one of the really big next steps, just in terms of going from being a pioneer to being a stakeholder.
Okay. Do you have a last question, Karen?
Karen Fisher, KEI. I just had a question, if you could elaborate a little about how you chose the subjects for your survey, and then also based on that, I'm wondering if in the survey you took kind of subgroups of Asian Americans into consideration, for example, biracial Asian Americans that might have American last name or adopted Asian Americans, and if not, in the future, if you take those groups into account, how do you think they would change the data in any way?
Mm-hmm. So, to be a representative survey of any sort, I think the classic model is still, at least the metaphor, is to get out these old yellow page phone books and randomly pick names. If you did that with Asian Americans, for every 100 names that you picked, only 6 would be in the sample that you actually want to interview. And the rates of refusal in terms of telephone interviews now are almost scandalously low. I'm almost afraid to share how low response rates are for a lot of telephone interviews today. It's not uncommon to have surveys that are reported in the media and reported in academic journals that have a response rate of 10% or less. So for every 100 people you actually identify as being people you want to interview, you'll get 10% or less who actually agree to spend any time on the phone with you. I share with my undergraduates the fact that I'm a public opinion researcher and I've never agreed to do a survey. So it's very, very difficult to reach people. So if you think about Asian Americans as a group, never mind, set aside Korean Americans, right? If you think about Asian Americans as a group, for every 100 that you want, if you just did random digit dialing, which is the same as looking at your telephone book, for every 100 numbers, only 6 will be in the group that you actually want to interview, and then maybe 1 out of 10 of those will actually agree to interview. This is a reason why it's been so difficult to do any surveys of Asian Americans. If you extrapolate out that kind of hit rate, it's an incredibly expensive group to survey. To do our kind of survey with a random digit dialing approach would have been something in the order of about $3 or $4 million to do that kind of study. So what we do now is take advantage of these huge consumer survey databases that essentially give each person a propensity of belonging to a certain group based on things like their first and their last name and a lot of their consumption habits. So, if I consistently buy Samsung instead of Sony or RCA, and if I, watch a lot, listen to a lot of, download a lot of K-pop on iTunes, even if my name were, John, Locke, they would assign me a higher than 0 propensity score of being Korean. So we use those databases. Now, the highest propensity of being Asian or being Korean will belong to people who have very ethnic-sounding names. So that means that the Korean Americans who are adopted and don't have a Korean-sounding name, even if a lot of their identity is as Korean and a lot of their consumption habits are very Korean, are going to have a lower likelihood of being in our survey. And that's what we find is that we're underrepresented in terms of our proportion of multiracial Asian Americans, for example, and that has something to do with that. But that's a much more efficient way of actually getting pretty representative data on what Asian Americans think.
All right, I think that's about all the time we have. So I want to thank all of you for coming. This has been really fascinating on looking at the voting behavior, and with all these reports and information that's coming out, this is definitely going to be very helpful for all of us when we're looking at all these things. So please pay attention to our website and emails for Dr. Lee's coming paper on this and our other academic paper series that are coming out this month. Please join me in thanking Dr. Taeku Lee.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.